Hey, what is going on, guys? I am the mystical Green Beanie, and Spider-Man No Way Home is a movie that I, honest to God, did not expect to enjoy as much as I did. Is it the best Spider-Man movie ever made? No. But it's still really good, and in my opinion, among the better end of the Spider-Man films. In fact, I'll spread my ass cheeks and fart this heresy across the internet. This is a better endgame than Avengers Endgame. Because unlike Avengers Endgame, this movie doesn't feel like it's coasting off of fan service alone. If anything, it's using fan service to inform the narrative. And of the MCU Spider-Man films, it is, without a doubt, my favorite of the three. I still have some core fundamental problems with it, but a lot of that was wrapped up in how the character was approached out the gate. So there's still weird stuff like just before Aunt MILF straps on her stilettos and struts herself up the stairway to heaven, she gives Peter the iconic "with great power" speech, which not only reaffirms the idea that Uncle Ben just doesn't exist in the MCU, and if he does, he didn't mean shit to Peter, but it retroactively makes this trilogy feel like an extended origin story for Peter Parker becoming Spider-Man. Making the choice to introduce Peter as an already established superhero not make sense. Like, at all. I mean, I know MCU fans like to wave their hands and say, hey, blah, 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 Uncle Ben doesn't even matter. You're just being nostalgic and stupid. But, no, you're wrong. The reason why Peter Parker becomes a superhero in the first place is because he inadvertently got Uncle Ben turned into the lyric to a rap song. It would be like making a Batman movie where Bruce Wayne is Batman, and Thomas and Martha Wayne are living their best life as coked out aristocrats on Epstein Island. Or a Superman movie, where Kal-El's rocket ship crash lands in the endless cornfields of Smallville, Kansas, and this young, kindly couple, Jonathan and Martha Kent, they approach the spacecraft very carefully, and they open the rocket door, and then a fully grown, butt-ass naked man just emerges from the pod, and he's like, hello, I am the Superman. Like, no, that defeats the purpose. You've made a new character at that point. But regardless, that's not what I wanted to talk about today. So, in watching this movie, which I've seen twice by now, something really stood out to me. I'm not the biggest fan of the Iron Boy Jr.-ness of Tom Holland's Spider-Man up to this point. In fact, my most popular video on the channel is just 7 minutes of me bitching about that exactly. But this film is sort of like an epilogue to that style of characterization, even if it does feel like a bit of an overcorrection in the end. But retroactively, and I feel like I'm going to say that word a lot in this video, but retroactively, with the first film hinging on Peter Parker wanting to live up to the legacy of Iron Man, and with Far From Home forcing Peter to reconcile with the legacy of Iron Man, No Way Home, despite Tony Stark surprisingly not looming over this film to the same degree as the first two, through Peter's actions, showcase how he is distinctly different from Tony Stark, and how, as a result, he's not only moved on from caring about Iron Man, he surpassed Iron Man. And this film, in its own weird way, really understands what makes Spider-Man, Spider-Man. So, in the film, spoilers by the way, if I haven't said that already, even after spoiling a pretty major plot point, but yeah, spoilers, getting right into it. After the events of Spider-Man Far From Home, Mysterio reveals to the public that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, which, in my opinion, leads to the most Marvel Comics feeling sequence in any of the Marvel movies. MJ starts getting harassed by random weirdos on the street, and people are trying to chase after Peter and MJ when they're running away, or they try to say, hey, you assaulted me, after Peter swats people's hands away when they try to approach him. Because that's the difference between the Marvel and DC universe, right? Superman can literally level an entire city fighting Doomsday or Bizarro or somebody like that, and then the civilians of Metropolis will they'll climb out of the wreckage and the rubble, and then they'll look into the sky and say,
"He saved us."
But say, if Spider-Man, for example, saves a woman from being violently assaulted in a sexual manner of the gang variety in, like, an alley somewhere, her immediate reaction would be,
"You okay?"
Get away from me, you freak!
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
Also, I think this might be the first Spider-Man movie where the general public reacts to Spider-Man like they do in the comics. And yeah, as a raging fanboy, I really appreciated that. I've been waiting 9 movies for it, but better late than never, right? Ah, shit, where was I going with this? Oh, right. So, Spider-Man's identity is added to the public, and as a result, Peter's life becomes a hell more horrifying than Guillermo del Toro's most vivid wet dreams. Peter, Ned, and MJ are denied admission to their dream college. Midtown High is crowded with grown-ass sociopaths and sycophants. Aunt May is facing legal ramification for being a negligent parent. And, okay, that last one I actually kind of agree with. But everyone's life who is connected to Peter's in some way goes to shit simply because he's Spider-Man. With the exception of Flash Thompson. Flash's life is actually pretty good because of it. So Peter goes to Doctor Strange to ask for help. And Doctor Strange is like, "Oh yeah, sure, we can totally fix your problems, and just come to my basement, we can talk about it more, Spider-Man." I don't know why I made it sound so nefarious. They actually have a pretty good rapport. I like it a lot. And Doctor Strange has this whole plan where he's going to make the world forget that Peter Parker was ever Spider-Man, and then Peter Parker, just being a complete dumbass, messes up the spell 5 times, which causes the multiverse to explode, bringing a bunch of supervillains from the previous 2 Spider-Man film franchises into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Which, from the trailers, just seemed very gimmicky and very fan-servicey. Which, it is, but I think it works very well, and here's why. So, Doctor Strange and Peter find a way to trap all of the multiversal supervillains in the Sanctum Sanctorum. There's Doc Ock, Electro, Sandman, Lizard, and the Green Goblin. And also, technically Venom, but we don't see him, so it doesn't really count. And Doctor Strange wants to send them all back to their universes. Back to the moments right before each of them died. But Peter, being the bleeding heart that he is, can't do that. His instinct is to save these people and give them a second chance. In fact, Peter spends the majority of his time trying to save and redeem these villains, so that when Doctor Strange finally does send them back to their universe, they don't have to suffer the same fate as we've seen in their previous films. That's like his main goal between Acts 2 and 3 of this movie. Even though Lizard and Sandman are like the only ones that didn't die in their universes, and also already had redemption arcs, so I don't quite get why Peter needs to save them, but it feels like one of those don't think about it kind of things, so I'm just not going to think about it. But this is the most Spider-Man thing you can have in a Spider-Man movie. Because one of the things that I think is really fascinating about Spider-Man in the comics is that all of his villains are a reflection of what Peter Parker could have been if he never learned his lesson about power and responsibility. With the notable exception of Norman Osborn, but I'll get to him later. Electro, Doc Ock, Lizard, Sandman, all of these guys, they were either brilliantly gifted scientists who had reached some sort of financial or emotional or psychological low point, or they were just poor people in the background who couldn't catch a break in life. Or they were some painfully unfortunate combination of the two. But then, by some freak accident of science gone wrong, they're given this unimaginable power, and much like Peter, their first instinct isn't to use that great power for the betterment of mankind or to help people. Their first instinct is to use their power for personal gain and lash out at a world that hurt them. And the haunting implication that not just the comics, but the MCU and the video games and TV shows play with is that most people on the street, if they got some weird kind of superpower, would more than likely turn out to be like Electro or Sandman, much rather than Superman or the Flash. And that's something that Peter is acutely aware of, because if it weren't for him learning his lesson in power and responsibility the hard way, after his Uncle Ben is shot in the street and bleeds to death in the gutters, he would have become like any of the other members of his rogues gallery. Again, you kind of run into problems with MCU Spider-Man because this trilogy implies that Uncle Ben doesn't exist, but I'm going to pretend like he does so that my point makes some kind of sense. That being, Peter sees himself in these guys, and he wants to give them all a second chance, and that's actually one of the things I really like about Tom Holland's Peter Parker in comparison to the other superheroes of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And funny enough, the Hawkeye series is doing a great job of pointing that out right now as I record this. The Avengers are soldiers. They very much react to threats and in most cases eliminate them. That is their primary objective. But Spider-Man isn't really a soldier. He's not an Avenger. He's a public servant. He's a member of the community. His primary objective is helping people. It's what he does. Even going back to Spider-Man Homecoming, after Vulture literally tries to beat a child to death twice, Peter's first instinct is to save his life so that his daughter won't get the news that she doesn't have a father anymore. Which I'm very sure hearing that news on the same night that you were stood up at Homecoming would be a little more than traumatic. But that's not something Iron Man would even take into account, or do. Hell, that's not something Captain America, the beacon of morality for the MCU, would even have the patience for. If any of the Spider-Man villains in this movie were going up against the Avengers, on sight, they would have been shot in the face, had a hole burned through their chest, or had a building dropped on their head. The core strength of being an Avenger does not lie in being empathetic. But it does for Spider-Man. And in many ways, one of Peter's greatest superpowers is his empathy. And to a point, which this movie also addresses. And that's what makes Peter Parker Spider-Man. And that's what separates Spider-Man from being an Avenger. His ability to level with otherwise ordinary people, because at the end of the day, Spider-Man is, otherwise, an ordinary person. And that's one of the two lessons that Peter learns here, with the second being... Okay, so just take everything that I said about the other Spider-Man villains and treat it like a baby, just shake it the fuck up and throw it out of a goddamn window, because none of that applies to the Green Goblin. And I'll keep this brief, but this is something that I really wanted to talk about. If the other Spider-Man villains represent power, but lacking any sense of responsibility, Norman represents power, but lacking any sense of morality. And how that sense of amoral power not only corrupts you and turns you into the worst version of yourself, but how that corruption can spread and influence others. And as I'm sure that everybody is aware of by now, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield reprised their roles as their respective Spider-Man for this movie, and according to Andrew's Peter Parker, it's very easy to allow that bitterness to shape you into the worst version of yourself. And the horrifying follow-up question that's implied is what happens to the world around you if you accept that darkness and live with it for too long. Much like Norman, you probably just infect everybody else until the world is just as fucked up as you are. And it's why Peter earns being a more traditional superheroic version of Spider-Man at the end of the film. Because even after the Green Goblin triggers a relapse in Electro, Sandman, and the Lizard, and even after he kills Aunt May, Peter doesn't allow the Goblin to corrupt him. Now, again, it's a little weird that these questions are being asked and answered in the finale of this Spider-Man trilogy, which began after Peter Parker was already established as being a superhero. So that question in theory should have already been answered, but for the sake of my enjoyment of this film, I'm just going to pass all of that. Also, just at this point, MCU Spider-Man is MCU Spider-Man. Some of those core foundational problems are still going to be there. But for the sake of the movie that we have, I appreciate it within context. Because for a trilogy that is more or less about Peter Parker being Tony Stark's legacy, there's something very profound in the idea that from Age of Ultron, really up until the end of his character arc, Tony Stark is a character hell-bent on saving the world, even from itself, to the point where he's literally a megalomaniacal fascist tool of the military-industrial complex, which is exactly what he was not only running from in the first 2 Iron Man movies, but actively fighting against. But Spider-Man No Way Home, this whole film shows why Peter Parker is a better superhero than Tony Stark. Peter never got lost in the plot. Peter, even if a little misguided at sometimes, never lost sight of the hero he wanted to be. Peter remained grounded, but in the best possible way. And a major reason as to how and why comes down to the simple fact that instead of lording over the world from an ivory tower, Peter is just a regular, everyday, normal motherfucker. His ability to save the world comes from the fact that he's actually a part of it. He's a hero of the people. He's a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.